Hello everyone, welcome back to Psychology 32, Lifespan Development. And today we have combined a number of chapters, I believe it's 14, 15, and 16. We've combined biological, psychological, and social development in adolescence. And one of the reasons why we combine the chapters is as you've been going along, you'll notice that a lot of the material and information tends to build on earlier material. And so it's not necessarily worth reviewing the earlier material again to avoid redundancy. So we'll still continue to build on Vygotsky's theory. We'll still continue to build on Piaget's theory. We'll continue to build on bioecological systems theory, etc. And what we're going to do is we're just going to advance along those next stages. We're going to talk about what happens physically with an adolescent and what defines adolescence. We're going to talk about what happens cognitively, and then we'll talk about what happens socially. One of the things that you might notice is that there are some links in the PowerPoint slides, so I highly recommend you take a look at those links and watch the videos. They help illustrate the points a little bit better. So let's get started. Okay, adolescent development. What marks adolescence or adolescent development are going to be physical and cognitive changes, but typically adolescence is marked by physical changes. Okay, and typically that's puberty, right? So key hallmarks of adolescence are going to be brain maturation, intense conversations, which is part of the cognitive developmental process. They continue in school, there are moral challenges, and there's typically more independence. Now, the age of adolescence varies. On the slide here, it says between 11 and 18, but that can change. Some people go through puberty early. Some people go through puberty late. Some people might go through it as early as 7 or 8 years old. Some people might go through it as late as 13 or 14 years old. But in essence, this is the average age range, and adolescence is marked by puberty. Okay, the physical changes that go along with development, more specifically, the physical changes that are associated with reproduction. Okay. All right, so puberty, again, between 18 and 14, typically there are heightened emotions in both males and females, heightened sexual desires, and puberty usually lasts about 4 years, give or take. It can be a little bit less, it can be a little bit more. In females, the typical pubescent physical changes are going to be nipple growth, pubic hair growth, a growth spurt, physical overall, widening of the hips, menarche, and full breast development. What we're talking about with puberty, if you look at the physical changes, they really are changes designed to support childbirth. Okay, nipples for nursing, widening of the hips for delivery, etc. Breast development for lactation, and this is really geared towards reproduction and childbirth. For males, growth of the testes, pubic hair, growth of the penis, ejaculation of live sperm. So males can ejaculate prior to puberty, but it's typically not live sperm, which means they can't reproduce. Facial hair, growth spurts, deepening of the voice, and pubic hair, continued growth. Again, most of this is for reproductive purposes. Okay, puberty typically starts with hormone release. And hormones are chemicals that are released usually from the pituitary gland into the body, and these chemicals cause the physical changes that we tend to see in puberty. Okay. Typically, in order, height is first, legs get longer, neck gets longer, and then weight comes after. Your nose might grow early on, and pubescent teens tend to be sort of disproportionate a lot of the time. They might have very long legs, large noses, big hands, big feet. They tend to get sort of clumsy, and then they typically grow into these features. They'll grow into their noses, they'll grow into their ears, they'll grow into their feet length, and they'll grow into their hands, etc. But again, you have to remember that your body grows very slowly or not at all most of the time. And then growing even, a couple of inches in a year is a lot. And you rely a lot on what they call proprioception, which is your understanding of where your body is in space. If your body grows, your proprioception needs time to catch up. It needs time to understand that your arm is longer. So when you stick your hand out, you estimate how far something is and how far you have to reach. And guess what? If your hand is 2 inches longer than it used to be, you're going to hit something before you actually reach it. And so in essence, you become clumsy, or your feet might stick out further than you expect, and you might trip going upstairs or going downstairs. All of these things tend to be happen during puberty. But typically people grow into their proprioception develops and they get more coordinated, etc. Okay? All right. Organs tend to grow and become more efficient. The lungs get much, much bigger, and adolescents tend to breathe more slowly and deeply than younger children do. The heart will double in size and beat more slowly and rapidly, and skin is going to change, becoming more oily. The texture and the density of hair is also going to change and follow adult-like hair patterns and hair growth patterns, etc. And in essence, you just look more adult-like. You can see sort of people who are prepubescent, and they tend to look younger. And again, this is marked by different physical features. And people who are post-pubescent tend to look older. Okay, they change. Now, the rate and the overall amount of these changes can be different. You can see adults that are in their 30s and 40s that, in essence, look prepubescent, and it could be because of a number of different things. Sometimes it's hair pattern. Sometimes, it's skin. Their skin might be extraordinarily clear and not oily at all, right? It could be a bunch of different things. But they might look prepubescent even if they're post-pubescent. Everybody changes differently, and that's normal. Okay? Cognitive development. Brain maturation tends to happen quite a bit. And there's an interesting video here if you take a look at it, and it shows conversations with children of different ages. It shows conversations in adolescence, and it shows conversations with younger children. And what they talk about is a level of abstraction. So one thing to understand overall in cognitive development is that there's tremendous amounts of variability. Some teens develop very quickly cognitively. Some teens develop at a sort of more typical rate, and some teens lag behind. It takes them a little while to catch up. They typically do catch up, but there's tremendous variability cognitively, intellectually in the teenage years, and that's perfectly normal. Okay, there's really nothing to worry about necessarily when it comes to that. Unless the person's falling dramatically behind, there's not that much to worry about. Different teenagers develop cognitively at different rates. Okay. One of the things that happens, right, we're talking now about Piaget's fourth stage, which is formal operational stage. And so you're talking about their ability to think abstractly, their ability to hypothesize and argue logically, etc. Okay. Couple of things about puberty that are hallmarks of adolescence. A couple of terms: adolescent egocentrism, theory of mind, the invincibility fable, and the imaginary audience. So egocentrism, we talked about before, with younger children, means that the belief that their experience is totally internal. Forgive me if the video jumps a little bit, I had to pause it. So adolescent egocentrism is this, we talked about egocentric, meaning focusing from your own perspective, right? And so adolescents continue this egocentric mentality where they really see the world only from their own perspective. There's a show that was on for a brief period of time. I think MTV bought the rights to it. It's called My So-Called Life, and it follows an adolescent female played by Claire Danes. You might know her from Homeland. And in essence, there's a running internal monologue that's happening all the time during the show, and it really does give you sort of insight into that adolescent thought process. And I remember one scene in the show where she's watching people eat, and she's sitting there saying, her internal monologue is saying, "Oh my gosh, people are sitting here eating in front of other people, and it's disgusting. Eating is digestion. And if people ever thought about what this really was, they wouldn't dare do it in public." And, she sees this as this real deep insight, this thing that nobody else has thought of. Nobody else has ever thought that eating was digestion. Nobody realized this, and nobody has come to the epiphany that she's come to. And she realized this because she is, uniquely special and everything about her is different than kind of everybody else in the world. And this is an egocentric belief set, right? Many people have thought about this many times over, and they've moved on, right? They've accepted society's norms and rules where people eat at the table, and that's what they do, and that's fine. But for the adolescent, this is a big deal. I thought of this and nobody else did, and that's significant in some way, and that's a normal part of adolescence. Another thing in adolescence that's very common and is important is something called theory of mind. Theory of mind is the understanding that other people's thoughts are different from their own. Okay? And theory of mind becomes very important, especially when you're talking about children with certain disorders like autism. So children with autism typically don't have theory of mind. They don't understand that people think and feel differently than they do, which is one of the things that really inhibits communication. And autism tends to inhibit social functioning more than anything else, and communication is one of the hallmarks of social functioning, or one of the cornerstones of social functioning. If you can't communicate, or let me go the other way, if you can't understand that other people's thoughts are different than yours, it makes it difficult to communicate. If you can't communicate, you can't engage in socially appropriate behaviors. It's very hard to. Adolescents should be developing a theory of mind. Adolescents believe that their experience is uniquely special, and they think that they're more socially significant, and this plays into the idea of the imaginary audience. They think everybody's watching them. They think that they're on stage. They think everything that they do is the center of everybody else's attention, and they believe that the world watches them. Okay? And it's one of these things where, this is why what you wear in puberty or after puberty becomes so important, because in essence, you're on stage. I mean, if you thought that everything you did, everybody was paying attention to, of course you would put more effort and energies into this, right? How could you not? Everybody's going to look at my shoes. Everybody's going to notice this shirt. I can't possibly wear that shirt. It doesn't fit, or it looks silly, and I can't wear that in public because everybody's going to make fun of me. And they really believe this. They're not over-dramatizing. They really do believe that everybody's paying attention to them. Now, this should end after puberty, but for some people this does continue. That imaginary audience and that belief that they're uniquely special and everything they do is significant. Another hallmark of adolescence is something that's called the invincibility fable. The invincibility fable is this belief that harmful things, bad things won't happen to them. Okay? It's this whole idea of, that's okay, I'm a better than average driver, I'm not going to get into an accident. It's okay, I can do drugs, I'm never going to overdose. It's okay, I can have unprotected sex, I'm not going to get an STD, or she's not going to get pregnant, or he's going to, or he doesn't have an STD, or whatever it is, right? And in essence, it's this invincibility fable, this belief that it's not going to happen to me, I'm not going to get hurt. And this is one of the reasons why adolescents tend to take so many risks. Part of it is impulsivity. Part of it is a not fully developed prefrontal cortex, which we talked about before in early childhood. But part of it is also this invincibility fable. Okay. Now, Piaget and ERICKSON. We've been talking about this before. So Piaget stage is formal operational thought. I mentioned this earlier. So it's not concrete operations. They can think abstractly, and they can think in complicated ways, and you can see an example of this if you click on that video link in the beginning of the chapter. And in essence, their thinking becomes more broad, outside of their own experience, more hypothetical, more complicated. Erickson's stage in puberty is what he called identity versus role confusion. And in this stage, he's saying that children and adolescents in particular, are getting an understanding of who they are. Their identity is developing, and they are moving past their parental teachings, and they're taking what they prefer and leaving what they don't prefer. And they're developing a unique identity unto themselves, which will lead to independence. Okay? Now, the goal is identity achievement, according to Erickson, where they establish their own unique identity. And like I said before, they accept some beliefs from their parents and others, and they reject others. There are hiccups in the identity development process, and Erickson called these either identity diffusion, foreclosure, or moratorium. Identity diffusion is when you lack a unique and distinct identity. and you sort of just do whatever everybody else does. Whatever other people listen to, you listen to the music. Whoever people follow politically, you follow because they follow. If people are interested in cars, you hang out with them, you're interested in cars. If people are interested in makeup, you hang out with them, you're interested in makeup, just because they're interested, not because this is something you really enjoy. That would be an example of identity diffusion. Foreclosure is when you just accept whatever identity your parents or the teachers are putting on you. They tell you who to be, and you accept that. You haven't explored your own identity. You haven't eliminated things from others and taken on other things that you find valuable. And identity moratorium is when you delay the identity search process. This just means you're not trying other things. You haven't foreclosed on your identity yet, because there's still potential in the future for you to develop your own unique identity. But you have, in essence, not explored your own unique identity yet. Okay. Now, in adolescence, the parent-child relationship changes quite a bit. So, like I said earlier, children value the input and the feelings and emotions of other children more so than they do their parents, just prior to adolescence, in that late childhood age. But at the same time, in adolescence, they're going to distance themselves even further. But they do need a healthy adolescent relation. They do need a healthy parent-child relationship. They do need communication. They do need support. They do need to maintain connectedness. And they do need to exercise a certain level of autonomy. But also parents need to maintain a certain level of control. And this is a difficult balancing act, because teenagers are always going to want to do more than they're ready to do. They're not going to want the boundaries. They're going to think that they know everything. But parents need to maintain those boundaries, but also allow the child to explore, but also support the child at the same time. Okay? Maintaining good and healthy relationships with the child, with the adolescent, is very, very important, because they will need you, like it or not, and admit it or not, they will need you. Okay? So this is something to be mindful of. All right. Peer relationships are very important in adolescence as well. Okay, some vocabulary: cliques and crowds. A clique is a very small, tight group of people that the adolescent hangs out with. A crowd is the larger group, and typically adolescents have both. They have the crowds, and they tend to have the cliques as well. So, what purposes do cliques and crowds serve? In essence, they serve a protective purpose, okay, more than anything else. I'm going to try to lower the frame here. In essence, they serve a protective purpose. Okay, they allow you to grow and flourish. They, in essence, protect you from threats. They protect you from isolation. They increase your social network. They're protection in a lot of different ways. One thing to remember, though, is peers can be as constructive as they are destructive. So peers can, on some level, be supportive emotionally, be supportive cognitively. They can really make you feel fit in, make you feel emotionally and socially satiated. But at the same time, they can also encourage you to do things you wouldn't normally do. They can make you take risks. They can make you violate social rules, social norms, parental rules, societal rules, etc. So they can be as constructive as they are destructive. So it's something to be mindful of. Now, peer selection. Peers tend to choose friends that are similar to themselves. They tend to choose people that like what they like. They tend to choose people that enjoy doing the things that they enjoy doing. And they tend to avoid or diverge from people that are too different from them. Okay? And there are so many different reasons for this. But in essence, people connect on common grounds, right? I mentioned before that peers can encourage you to do things that you wouldn't normally do. And there's actually a research study that talks about adolescence and adolescent impulse control. And what the research study argues is that adolescents have a fully developed sense of logic and reasoning, and they have the ability to think things through, but they also have emotions and impulses. And what the article argues is that peers, when they're adolescents, when they're surrounded by their peers, tend to listen more to the impulsive and emotional side of the brain than they do to the logic side of the brain. When they're alone, they tend to listen to the logic side of the brain. So peer facilitation is the idea, or peer pressure, which is another way to put it, is the situation where peers will encourage you to do things that you wouldn't normally do on your own. Okay. All right. Sexuality. Typical sequence of male-female relationships. And again, it's not always like this. Different cultures, different backgrounds have different experiences. But commonly or frequently, typically they're homogeneous groups. Boys go with boys, girls go with girls. And then what will start to happen is these groups will start to loosely associate. The boy groups and the girl groups will kind of hang out near each other or approximate each other. And then they'll break off into small mixed sex groups. And then eventually people will couple off, developing private relationships. People will start to date, they'll get together, they'll break up, they'll get back together, they'll get together with other people in the group, but that's how the typical dating process will happen and evolve. Now, heterosexual versus homosexual relationships. Typically for heterosexual individuals, the first romances appear in high school, and they don't last very long. Less than a year, typically. They might even last one period. You're somebody's boyfriend or girlfriend, in period one. By the time you get to study hall, you've broken up. It happens. And that's not that uncommon. For homosexual youth, it gets complicated. And the reason why it tends to get complicated is because, for better or for worse, like it or not, the world that we live in assumes a heterosexual orientation. It just does. And that's changing. And, homosexual orientations, bisexual orientations, gender non-normative behaviors tend to be more widely accepted, and they tend to be pervading our culture a little bit more. But the assumption is that if you're, gender presenting as male, you're a boy and you like girls. And the assumption is if you're gender presenting as female, you're a girl and you like boys. In essence, that's really what the assumptions are. So dating, which is already a hard thing, gets more complicated for people whose sexual orientation is homosexual rather than heterosexual, because in essence, it's risky, right? If you're homosexual and you approach somebody, number one, there's always the potential for rejection in any dating relationship. And number two, what if the person that you're approaching is heterosexual? And this could, lead to awkwardness. It could lead to loss of friendships. It could lead to ostracism. In some cases, it can lead to assault, right? So it gets more complicated. And dating for homosexual youth tends to be much, much more difficult. And it's not uncommon, again, because you're being told that you're supposed to be heterosexual. I'm using air quotes when I say supposed to be. In essence, there's a lot of pressure to be heterosexual. And it's hard. It's a hard thing to do when you're homosexual, to grow up in a heteronormative world. Okay. Now, as far as reproductions go, overall teen births have decreased dramatically. Protection has increased, particularly condom use, and this is usually because of condom availability. And subsequently, since teen pregnancy has gone down, abortion rates have also gone down. Okay. The argument is that if we make condoms available, if we make sex education available, this is going to encourage sex, but the research and the data just don't show that. The research and data show the opposite. Making condoms available, sex education classes reduces pregnancies, it reduces STDs, it reduces overall lower levels of health, includes high school dropouts and all that kind of stuff. There seems to be very few drawbacks. Now, this gets into a more religious debate where if you believe in prophylactics at all, and that's a different discussion. If you just want to reduce teen pregnancy and you just want to reduce STDs, then prophylactic use, particularly condom availability, tends to be extremely effective, and all the research says the same thing. If you don't believe in the use of prophylactics, that's a different discussion to have. Okay? All right, now we're going to talk about a topic that's a little bit more difficult. We're going to talk about depression in adolescence, and we'll talk a little bit about suicide. Okay. Depression can happen at any age. It can happen in early middle childhood. It can happen in late childhood, adolescence, early middle adulthood, late adulthood, etc. Depression can happen at any time. Depression in early middle childhood tends to look a little bit different than it does in adolescence. Depression in early middle childhood tends to look like anger and frustration. It can look like aggression. Depression in adolescence tends to look like adult-like depression. And when we're talking about adult-like depression, we're not talking about just sadness, okay? We're talking about clinical depression. Okay, we're talking about depression that meets clinical significance, and you're talking about a number of different symptoms. Anhedonia, meaning you don't get pleasure in the activities that you got pleasure in before, sad mood, changes in sleep, changes in eating, possible thoughts of suicide, right? These are all the hallmarks of depression. It's not just being sad and brooding, okay? It's way beyond that. And the depression rates in adolescents tend to match those of the depression rates in adults. So in the adult population, 15% overall has depression, 2 to 1 women to men. And in the adolescent stage, overall average is 15%. One in 5 teenage girls demonstrates clinically significant depression. 1 in 10 teenage boys, so 2 to 1, 20% versus 10%. Again, forgive me if the video is choppy. I had to pause it for a second. So 1 in 5 teenage girls, which is 20% of the population, teenage female population, experiences clinical depression. 1 in 10 teenage boys experiences clinical depression. If you average that out, it's about 15%, which is typical standard rates of depression for the population overall. There's a lot of different reasons why teenagers can experience symptoms of depression. First of all, heightened hormonal levels lead to heightened emotional experiences. So there's a biological reason for this. Also, as the brain tends to develop, the brain is going to look more adult-like and function in a more adult-like way. And this can ultimately, if adults are experiencing depression and your brain is more adult-like, there's no reason to believe that it wouldn't experience depression at the levels of adults. Also socially and interpersonally, there are a lot of changes that happen in the teenage years, and there are a lot of social pressures, there are a lot of academic pressures. Thinking from a Western society, this is when you're developing relationships, this is when you're getting your first after-school job, this is when you're trying to apply to a college, this is when you're going to be separated from your friends for the first time. There are a lot of stressors that tend to happen quite frequently in the teenage years that aren't necessarily there beforehand. Again, I'm sorry if this video is jumpy. I just had a number of interruptions. So getting back to clinical depression in teenagers, again, the numbers in teenagers represent similar numbers or similar percentages to adults. And, there are a couple of different potential causes for depression in teenagers. I mentioned before, life factors, environmental factors, right? A lot of external demands, a lot of social demands, as well as, potential biological factors. There are a lot of hormones being released, and ultimately, there are a lot of physical changes that are happening in adolescence that can, lead to at least changes in mood, if not clinical depression. Now, as with depression, typically what's commonly found, or what can be found, is suicide. So we're going to talk a little bit about suicide. Now, the first thing to understand when we talk about suicide is that suicide is rare. Okay? It does not happen very often. And although it's a terrible thing when it does happen and it's considered preventable, it is very rare overall. And statistically, adolescents are actually less likely to kill themselves than adults are. The highest rates of suicide in the population are actually older Caucasian males. They tend to be more likely to commit suicide, although females tend to be more likely to attempt suicide. But Caucasian males tend to be more likely to complete suicide, and adolescents tend to be less likely overall to complete suicide than adults. So a couple of things to watch out for, or key warning factors. Family history, believe it or not, tends to be highly predictive of suicidal behavior. We're not actually sure. There was an article that I had read once that said that there actually might be a genetic component to suicidal behavior, but it was one article, and I'm not sure about the current research on that. History of previous attempts. If you've attempted in the past, it makes it more likely for you to attempt in the future, and the more attempts, the more likely you are to complete it. History of impulsiveness, doing things without thinking. Substance abuse. People who use substances of abuse are more likely to commit suicide than people who don't. History of physical or sexual abuse makes you more likely to commit suicide. And cluster suicides, which is an odd thing, but it does happen. There are situations where an individual will kill him or herself, and then somebody close to them, a very, very close friend or family member, might end up attempting or completing suicide themselves shortly after. And it does happen. We've seen this in situations in schools where, a student will kill themselves, and then ultimately then a close friend will kill themselves shortly after. The best prevention for cluster suicides is delay. Get in touch with the people who know the person who killed themselves and make sure that those people are safe. And if enough time passes, it makes people less likely to commit suicide. Now, bullying. Bullying is one of the things that's mentioned as far as contributing to suicide, but the research on that is limited. History of physical abuse, yes. And if bullying is considered physical abuse, then yes. The reason why I have a question mark there is, as we talked about in one of the previous slide decks, the definition of bullying tends to keep changing or evolving, or people use bullying in very different ways. And so, in essence, true bullying may contribute to an increase in suicide or suicidal attempts. But a lot of the things that we think about, assaults, stuff like that, are not necessarily bullying behavior. Okay? So it's just something to be mindful of. Anyway, in general, if there is an issue, if you suspect that there's a problem, call somebody. Call an ambulance, call the person's parents, whatever it is, make them aware of it. The worst that's going to happen is the person's going to get mad at you and stop speaking with you. The best thing that could happen is you could save their life. If you don't call, the worst thing that can happen is the person might not be here any longer. Okay? So when it comes to suicide, it's not something to really mess around with. And the myths are that, if somebody's talking about it, they're not going to do it. That's absolutely not true. And the myths are that people just talk about it for attention-seeking purposes. That's not true either. So just be mindful of these things. If somebody's evidencing signs of depression, signs of suicidality, definitely make somebody aware of it. Okay? All right, that ends the slide deck. And again, I apologize if it was a little bit choppy. There were a number of interruptions, but as always, if you have any questions, email me, david.troy@kbcc.cuny.edu. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the week.